welcome back. Good to see you. We're here with another belated episode of Revisiting the Road to Serfdom. Kevin of Engineering Politics and myself, typical, right? Just as we were starting to pat ourselves on the back, we just completely ruined it. But that's okay. That's okay. Family stuff. This time around, I bear the brunt of the responsibility. But we're here doing chapter 14. And we're getting towards the end of the book, Kevin. How do you feel about that, man?
You know, it's been a long travel, long path to get to the end of this book. And I just want to thank my family.
A long road.
Yes. Oh yeah, that's a good word for it. Sorry, it's been a while since I reviewed the cover of the book. Have been too much between the beginning and end. But it's been fun. It's been a great way to like really get in depth. But the really sucky part about engaging with a book is the author rarely ever talks back. And so many times, and I know we'll do it today, hey, what would Hayek say today about this stupid thing we're doing right now? Or what would he say? Hey, did you read my book in 1944? Maybe you should stop doing this. I told you to stop doing this back then, how it ruined two other societies. Maybe you should stop doing it. Stop hitting yourself in the face. And maybe the pain would stop. So that's my main takeaway so far.
Yeah, it's kind of a bummer being at the end of it, and I feel like we're kind of, I think on our notes we have like 97 or 98 pages, so it feels like we gotta like stick the landing pretty good on this thing, but we're not quite there yet. So before we get into chapter 14, Kevin, why don't you give the folks at home a review of our extremely long and arduous, at least in preparation, episode from last week, and what that covered.
So for those of you who watched or listened to episode 12, I hope that was good enough for the 30 to 40 hours of like work we put into it. But we'll see.
I haven't listened to it yet, man. It stresses me out.
that last one covered several different or two different chapters. So covered chapter 12, which is the socialist roots of Nazism, and chapter 13, the totalitarians in our midst. So chapter 12 covered the pre-World War II Germany, and even covered all the way up through pre-World War I Germany, throughout World War I. So it gave an awesome social trajectory of what Germany had at the time. And then chapter 13, the totalitarians that are mixed, covered current day, or what was current day for Hayek, Great Britain. So it kind of did a good job at pairing these two different trajectories and attitudes that went along with them side by side as much as you can through a book. And we attempted to do our best to really put those side by side and then add another chapter into it that was modern day America, and try to see if we could build analogs there. So effectively, we tried to rewrite the chapter, and we did this by pulling away the main attitudes found in Germany and Britain, how we see how it related to a contemporary context. And we found three inherent attitudes highlighted by Hayek, including one, the abandoned road to liberalism, because liberalism is weak. It's a strong message, especially in chapter 12. They hated weakness. This is the Prussian instinct we talked about there. All weakness is bad, and they saw liberalism as weakness because liberalism naturally advocates for a weak government, right? But weak in some contexts is really, really useful, and we would argue, I think, especially here, that a weak government is exactly right. We used to have a weak president. So number two that we went through is the left and right come together to push organization, planning, and socialism. They saw this in Germany when he said the socialists on the progressive left and the conservative right ended up combining forces, and that's how you got World War I and floated into World War II. You saw the same thing in Britain, and you certainly see the same thing today in America, where the left and right kind of project. They're the AOC and Ted Cruz. That's what you see, left and right battling each other as intellectually as they can get, and that is what we see forward facing, but in the background, they agree on everything. They agree on foreign policy. They agree on monetary policy. All these things they're agreeing with. So there really is no different. And that should be a red flag when both sides who advertise, because it's just lying, right? The end of truth is the previous chapter. Lying is the end of truth. When they advertise you one thing, but are doing something else in the back room, that's should be a red flag for all of us, I think.
Yeah, that's the Michael Malice, tweet that I mentioned, I think maybe in the last one, where the conservatives, at least in the modern American context, their main objection to socialism is the cost. And that's it. Like, man, that'd be great if we could control everything. It's just too expensive.
Right, exactly. And the third inherent attitude is the individual must be subservient to the state. This is obvious in Germany, became obvious during Hayek's time in Britain, and is becoming more and more obvious as we see today, especially with COVID restrictions, stuff like that. Even though it seems like a serious time to be, adding these restrictions, they're talking about subservience. You must be subservient to what we say, what we do, what we believe, or you're going to be outcast as those horrible mega Trump supporters that all stormed the Capitol on January 6th. We all have to fight against that American version of the Taliban. They're calling people who just say, maybe I shouldn't wear a mask everywhere I go because they're relatively ineffective. So all of this builds that out group, which is a certain inherent attitude you need before we get to the next step, which are the inherent attitudes are necessary to build the progression towards totalitarianism, in which we broke down 3 different progressive stages that include: 1, pushing for organization and planning by relevant politicians and famous people. So there's a whole bunch of politicians we cited, some economists, and even some, at the time they called famous people, but they're like, really famous chemists, like Nobel Prize winning chemist was one in particular that was kind of like their version of a rock star back then, or their version of a Hollywood elite, which is what we have now in America. The Hollywood elites, the people who aren't even really experts in the field, although that's not totally relevant. They're seen as experts because they have a lot of power, because they're famous, effectively, and a lot of people just
they'll bring Jeff Daniels on to talk about politics, or they'll bring Robert De Niro on to talk about the mob because they played characters
right.
with some experience, because they pretended to be someone who knows about those things. So that tells you everything you know right there about some of the intellectual class. We'll bring on people who pretended to know about this stuff, and so they can come and pretend to know about it as themselves instead of pretending to know about them as their character.
Oh, for sure. Wasn't Jeff Daniels the guy who was afraid of spiders?
That's actually a good movie, I think, anyways. But
good movies. Yeah. So the second progressive stage we saw is called the war economy. This is something we'll talk about today, but the war economy is what gets planning's foot in the door and allows it here to stay. And the war economy doesn't necessarily acquire an actual formal war. So it's war type language that's important here. Obviously, Germany had World War I, World War II, and the Franco-Prussian War before that. Britain had World War II, and America, although, obviously the war in Afghanistan was one that's not really one that forced us to align, our industries in order for some sort of war production, because it wasn't as large of a scale. But war on poverty, war on terrorism is one of those more general wars. War on COVID, all these different war terminology,
climate change,
that allows us to kind of tighten the liberties and freedoms of people who own businesses, or just the freedom of movement, or freedom to do what you want, and forces them to actually be more ordered and according to whatever the government elites want them to do. And the third and final stage is we get a society run by experts. We see this certainly today in America, run by the experts, but it's the same thing they did in Germany. All these experts, especially the doctors and engineers and the kind of intelligentsia, were all to a surprising point hopped on the German fascist National Socialist side almost immediately. Same thing happened in Britain, and you see it happening a lot today, that you think the experts are kind of that first line of defense, but often they're the first ones who start to agree with the people in power, because they see that as an opportunity to further their expertise or further whatever they're advocating for as a single-minded plan. It's like, oh, I can, I want to accomplish this one thing, but if I advocate for the power that's about to cede all this controlled and concentrated power, I can get that one thing done really, really fast. So they kind of hop on board, and they're super easy to attract into these totalitarian movements.
Yeah, and usually those are the people who came up with the stupid plan in the first place. So they have this plan, and they have these grand ideas, of putting their particular interest or their pet project at the center of something, and then they use the wars or war analogy or create or fabricate it, to get people's attention and centralize power. And then lo and behold, what a total coincidence. They're the ones in power with all of the consolidated authority and power and coercive force after it's all done. It's so weird that the people who came up with the plan have, unilateral control of the entire nation whenever the plan's put in place. I'm sure it's a coincidence. I know that Ayanna Pressley, would just happen to be in charge or be, part of the, anti-racist cabinet or department of, whatever bullshit.
It would be an inclusive move.
Yep. It would just, it'd be inclusive. Or you'd think that she would give it to like a trans person instead to be more inclusive. I know that they're really good. The people who advocate for this stuff are really good about forfeiting their spots to put someone more diverse, in their place. I know they're really good about that. So I'm sure that would actually happen.
Absolutely. But the purpose of the last episode that we really tried to accomplish there is to refute the idea of this can't happen to us. So often is that the excuse of, well, we're not Germany, so why would this happen to us? It's not going to happen to us. Because it never happens to any country all at once. It's a slow, gradual process into collectivism. It always starts with collectivism and then leads to the concentration of power, which then leads to totalitarianism. So you need to not think it's just going to happen to you in one day, but look at the path, look at your social trajectory, and try to figure out, okay, are we in line with people who've gone down this path before? And should we try to bring ourselves back on the path towards freedom instead of the path to servitude?
Yep. That's good. That's a good intro, Kevin. So this chapter is called Material Conditions and Ideal Ends. And another way of framing this is thinking about, so material conditions is reality as it presents itself. It's what are the conditions of the material world in front of us that we have engaged with in the past and we have to engage with now. And ideal ends are, that's the utopian kind of thing. He's not talking about shoot for the moon, because even if you miss, you'll land among the stars, or something like that, although maybe a little bit, or to not have ideals or to not have goals you're striving for that, for the betterment of society. But he's saying that whatever those ends are, they have to be tethered to the material conditions of the world as it presents itself to you. They can't be completely disjointed from reality. So this is another way of saying reality versus delusion. And I don't even necessarily mean delusion in a pejorative sense. It could just be naive delusion, of someone who just has no concept of how the world works or human nature or anything like that. We're going to get into some of those things. But this chapter, it's very obvious. And we talked a little bit about this in chapter 13, but this is where Hayek is like, okay, it's pretty obvious we're going to win the war. And this is no longer about the Nazism or anything like that. I think I'm not even sure if I remember him mentioning Nazism. I think maybe once or twice.
Hitler's name came up once or twice, but Hitler, it was always recognized as a precursor to Hitler. He never really even touched on Nazism.
Yeah, he doesn't really talk about Germany or anything like that much. He's talking about what's going on in Great Britain at that time. And I think at one point he even talks about all of our civilization hinges on us getting this right coming out of the war. In other words, Nazism isn't the threat in Hayek's mind as you read this chapter. The threat is the totalitarians in their midst and the ideas that they were propagating. And so just one quote here, and this is similar to some of the themes in previous chapters, but I think this kind of tees up the ideas that are at tension kind of nicely. Hayek says the only alternative to submission to the impersonal and seemingly irrational forces of the market. So he's saying, look, so that's the material conditions, right? The world as it is in a liberal being, a free, open, classical liberal sense society, not liberal as we think about it today, is to submit to the free market and free exchange of goods and ideas. And Hayek says the only alternative to that is submission to an equally uncontrollable and therefore arbitrary power of other men. In his anxiety to escape the irksome restraints which he now feels, man does not realize that the new authoritarian restraints, which will have to be deliberately imposed in their stead, will be even more painful. And so what he's getting at is this is kind of bringing it full circle to the introduction in the very beginning of the book in The Abandoned Road, where he talks about how there were these practices and principles and sensibilities that they used in terms of freedom, liberty, free exchange of ideas, and just letting what looks arbitrary or looks chaotic, but really is just all of these individual exchanges of goods and services play out. He's saying if there is a lot of people now who are finding that they're impatient with it, it's not doing what they want it to fast enough. They probably don't even understand it in the first place. And there's a lot of reasons for that. that we've talked about in other episodes. But if they think and they're frustrated at that and how it works or whatever, or they're disillusioned with that system, the only alternative is to put some authoritarians in charge, and they might do that under benevolent, auspices or whatever. But he's saying that's going to be just as uncontrollable as the market we have now, and it will also be arbitrary. The problem is it will be way more painful than this market, because there's a huge asymmetry of the control. Like once you give up your freedom, you might feel like you don't have any freedom in a market, but you do. You have some that you can leverage for more freedom and more wealth, and we'll get into the generation of wealth later. But if you give all this power to men, even no matter what promises they make, it's going to actually be more painful. And so Hayek is bringing really the argument full circle and getting back into, it feels like one way, just a thing that just came to my mind, and I'll kick it back to you, Kevin, is that he could almost say here, the abandoned road versus the road to serfdom, instead of material ends versus ideal, or material conditions versus ideal ends. It feels like he's bringing those ideas back full circle of just contrasting the options that lay before them after, this entire book. I mean, this is the second to last chapter of the book, after, again, building that argument and building it up of like, are we going to continue down this path or not? And he fleshes out exactly what it means if they do continue down that road to serfdom. So anyway, so I'm going to tease up what this conversation is about, but just be thinking about this in your mind as we're going through it, is like, what's it mean to engage in reality as it presents itself? That includes reality of human nature, reality of the previously observed principles that led to prosperity, and so on and so forth. And what's it mean to naively and arrogantly reject that to impose some new untried system because you think it'll lead to a more moral or just society? So it's utopia versus reality is really, I think, the framework that Hayek is putting forth here. So anyway, back to you, bud. I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah. Well, I think that, when you talk about freedom here is really maximizing choice without minimizing everyone else's choice.
Yeah,
that's a really big thing, because also we think of freedom as maximizing choice. So what the left often does is, or the collectivists often do, is they'll hijack that idea and say, all right, well, you don't have enough money to get healthcare, so now your choices are going lower, so let's give you healthcare. Okay, well, now you're going to start to get in the realm of minimizing others' choices, and that's called privilege. That's called arbitrary law, arbitrary rules, and that's what you really want to avoid. And so, as he does with all these chapters, he opens up with a quote from someone else. This one he did with John Milton, and he gets into it really, really well here when it comes to individual people advocating for individualism versus people that just advocate for like one small collective thing. And I think it's quite a brilliant breakdown. So, quote, "Is it just or reasonable that most voices against the main end of government should enslave the less number that would be free? More just it is, doubtless, if it come to force, that a less number compel a greater to retain, which can be no wrong to them, their liberty, than that a greater number, for the pleasure of their baseness, compel a less most injuriously to be their fellow slaves. They who seek nothing but their own just liberty have always the right to win it whenever they have power, be the voices never so numerous that oppose it." So basically here is my interpretation of what he's saying, is there's basically no chance that people who only care for their own liberty will ever advocate for the enslavement of others, because why would they? It's like, if I just want here, and it's like, you do what you want over there, just let me and my family do what we want over here. Why would there's no opportunity to enslave, because there's no coercive power, there's no coercive or even corrupt relationship between me and my family versus someone else out there. It's just not logical for any ability to enslave or impede on someone else's freedoms, in that relationship. But for those who advocate for control of just one little part, this one little part of someone else's life, they absolutely have the capacity to enslave others, even if it's not completely their intention, because you've already opened the floodgates here. Yep. It's a behavior that's like, all right, I'm just going to control this little part to make sure you don't, pollute the rivers and the lakes. That's all I want to control. It's all right. Well, it's a good control. I think that's a reasonable thing to ask in society, for sure. But now you need to understand your own capacity for being able to say, all right, well, you know what, I really don't like that you litter. I also think that hurts the environment. I'm going to start control that. I don't like how much you drive. It's just too much CO2 going in the air. I'm going to start doing, some sort of gas tax or something that's going to allow you or force you to drive less. And then it just keeps rolling and rolling and rolling until you get to the point where it's like, all right, I need to control everything you do, because it's something that you'll do. You go outside and you step on a grasshopper, that's going to hurt the environment. So now I need to start controlling more and more things. And, that is the just recognizing your own capacity to extend that coercive power compared to someone who's like, I have no interest in coercive power. So there's no way I'm going to enslave you. It's just thinking about those two extremes.
Yeah. And also I think it's a good way of teasing a little bit or seeding the idea of getting into human nature and how that plays like really heavily into like this chapter. So it's good. And for anyone who is curious about like, man, that Milton quote seems like it's pretty hard to read. John Milton was born at the beginning of the 1600s, and that's just how they wrote back then. So that's a relatively even short sentence for someone.
Yeah, I've definitely heard the last sentence in that one, but seek nothing but their own just liberty. But like whenever I read old timey people, is what I call it. It's super hard to understand. Like I had to read that like 5 times to completely understand what he was saying. And it's just because they use kind of like these double negatives, and you don't like, do you mean this thing or do you mean the opposite of this thing? It reminds me a lot of that scene in What Is the Office, where he says, don't bother. I forgot the guy's name, but he said, don't bother this guy. And then he puts a circle around it with a cross then. And it's like, don't bother him. And he's like, yeah, no. And then he erased it and like, don't. And then he writes the word don't bother him. Like, that's as clear as I can get it, guys.
Yeah,
so it reminds me a lot of that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, they use negatives in the most awkward pot. Instead of like so and so doesn't like this, it's like, hath not he to like such and such a thing? Surely not. He could like this thing. By no means, or something completely ridiculous. Like,
okay, henceforth, therefore.
Exactly. How about just Jim doesn't like grapes or whatever it is? So the next quote that kind of gets into this is, it may sound noble, and I will say, I'll interrupt myself here. He gets a lot into the morals and just the rhetoric of morals in this chapter. And there's a lot of contemporary analogs for that, just so you guys can be thinking about it. It may sound noble to say, damn economics, let us build up a decent world, so it's like, it's for the greater good. It might not be factually correct, but it's morally right, AOC. But it is, in fact, merely irresponsible. With our world as it is, and with everyone convinced that the material conditions here or there must be improved, our only chance of building a decent world is that we can continue to improve the general level of wealth. And so Hayek is saying, we understand some of the preconditions for prosperity and for the alleviation of human suffering. What we've seen, and this is the road that we're abandoning, is as we increase the wealth in society, the general wealth, that's that whole rising tide lifts all ships kind of thing. As that happens, then we will have a more and more decent world. That's what we know how to do that. And he's saying it's irresponsible to throw away that way of doing it, because, I think there's, 2 groups here, as there always is. There's the people who say it's too slow and they're idealists and they're naive. And then there's also the people that know it, that might work, but I'm not on top of the power structure in that system. And so, we need to do this other thing. But either way, Hayek is saying that it's irresponsible. It's completely irresponsible to say damn economics, because proper knowledge of economics, proper knowledge of the way in which people acquire wealth is, that at least at this point in time, and I would argue still to this day, the only way right now that we know to, on a wide scale, alleviate societal suffering. And that is just to increase wealth through the method that we've used before.
Yeah. Economics is the science of how people interact with value. And the left tends to look at and interact with economics as some sort of social construct that is created by the rich and powerful. Yep. So it's this thing that, and as we'll get to a little bit later, this thing you can kind of throw in the background. And pretending economics doesn't require a balance of productive value and competition are going to see the economy as an obstacle to their desired ends, as opposed to actually something that again, like a science of figuring out how people can be incentivized to do a certain thing and disincentivized to do it in a free market that doesn't require a full, planning board to try to plan everyone's logical steps out. But this effectively eliminates the economic freedom, which, as Hayek explains in the previous chapters, is a prerequisite of all freedoms. And taking that away is, as Hayek says here, absolutely irresponsible. I love the quote. It feels like a damn economics. Let us build up a decent world, right? It's like, it sounds like such a thing to like rally people around. It's like this great thing. It's like, wow, who cares about, the Amazon's bottom line? Let's just make a decent world, right? And it's like, oh, okay, well, again, what's your limiting principle there? Like, it's easy to say, oh, this guy's doing something wrong, right? You talk about Amazon. It's like Bezos is totally against it either. He's like, oh, I agree with you for sure. And then you should get a little confused and be like, all right, what's happening here? Because it's not those big guys you're affecting. It's going to be the small guys who try to compete with those big guys that you affect by trying to build this better world by destroying someone else's.
Yeah. And just real fast on that, I think you make an excellent observation there about how a lot of the people advocating for these policies think that economics is just a thing that was created by powerful people, as opposed to just it's something that we observe, like transactions and humans' desire to trade with each other and barter, and that kind of system. That's an observed phenomenon in nature, more so than something that we created. Obviously, there are things that we create that might streamline that process or hinder it. But either way, it's a pre-existing phenomenon, and I think, like, you get a lot of these people who think that and I think they have the same view of like rights. Rights are something that's created. All of this is a created thing, and we are so smart we could create a better version of it, is how they think about it. And that gets back to a theme that I think that we've observed time and time again in this, is just the complete arrogance and like naive, blind, foolish pride to think that you can do it better than naturally observed phenomenon, just because you are convinced you can. And it's completely ludicrous, but I think you're dead on that they think economics and the desire to trade with one another is something that was created as opposed to exists, and you can observe it in nature. And the same way with, again, with rights. And there's just a lot of dangers whenever you have like, the view that rights are created and are granted by the government or something, as opposed to pre-existing. So anyway, but I totally agree with that.
Yeah. To take away from economics, I think, it's why capitalism is not actually an ism. It's a description of behavior. It's not this thing that we're forcing people to do. It's something that people, I struggle to say naturally, just as we think freedom is a default condition. I don't know if bartering with each other is necessarily a natural a default condition. I think the default condition is I take your stuff. This is why you see kids just take other kids' stuff. So it's almost more natural to go toward the collective tendency, I think. But when you try to build a culture of freedom and liberty, this is a prerequisite for it. This is why economic freedom is a prerequisite for all those other freedoms, is because if you don't have the ability to make these own choices yourself, then what's the point? You don't have choice anywhere if you can't do it there, right?
Yeah. No, I agree.
So this gets on the next one where he starts to talk about economic arguments and economic
specific to his time.
Specific. And he identifies a lot of things here that we can identify today, as he does throughout the chapter. So, quote, in a different sense, it is no doubt true that our generation is less willing to listen to economic considerations than was true of its predecessors. It is mostly decidedly unwilling to sacrifice any of its demands to what we call economic arguments. It is impatient and intolerant of all restraints on its immediate ambitions, unwilling to bow to economic necessities. It is not any contempt for material welfare or even any diminished desire for it, but on the contrary, a refusal to recognize any obstacles, any conflict with other aims which might impede the fulfillment of their own desires, which distinguishes our generation. Economophobia would be a more correct description of this attitude than any doubly misleading end of economic man, which he repeats several times before this, which suggests a change from a state of affairs which has never existed in a direction in which we are not moving. Man has come to hate and to revolt against the impersonal forces to which in the past he submitted even even though they have often frustrated in his individual efforts. So here, to me, it's the growing popularity of collectivism doesn't stem from the hatred of material things, right? Even though the result always ends up in less material prosperity when you go to collectivism, people want collectivism because they want their desires for society to be prioritized and met, right? If I want to end poverty, this is so as I go into here, so if someone wants to get rid of like poverty, for an example, creating a coercive power to battle poverty is a good thing, right? It's a good thing. You can change out poverty with really anything, gender or racial equality, wealth disparities, unemployment, or really anything you want. The point is, these different desires are seen as outside of the realm of politics, even though that they might actually have something to do with it. Unemployment is something explicitly to do with politics, and therefore economic logic can be ignored. This is why you don't have to think about, the interchange between two different people who can make this free choice. It's just something that's seen outside the realm of economics. And Hayek uses an example, full employment, later in the chapter, and I'll just quote it here real fast. It is, in fact, in this field that the fascination of vague but popular phrases like full employment may well lead to extremely short-sighted measures, and where the categorical and irresponsible "it must be done at all costs" of a single-minded idealist is likely to do the greatest harm. It's the short-minded or short-sighted single-mindedness that destroys everything around the goal, while also failing to achieve the goal in the long run. Because if everything, so the structures fall down around it, that single structure, that single goal is not going to be able to stay upright either.
Yeah, I think Economophobia was that Jeff Daniels movie you mentioned earlier. But there's a quote here I want to read again that you read, and just I'm going to substitute one or two words. I'm going to substitute the word economic arguments for reality, and tell me if this doesn't sound like a contemporary description of what we see, especially in the younger, like Gen Z and millennials today. It is most decidedly unwilling to sacrifice any of its demands. You could say this: the younger generations that we see today, or the idealist or the naive or whatever, they're unwilling to sacrifice any of their demands to what we would call logic or reason or reality. They're impatient and intolerant of all restraints on their immediate ambitions, and unwilling to bow to anything that resembles reality. It is not any contempt for material welfare, or even any diminished desire for it, but on the contrary, a refusal to recognize any obstacles, as in realities, any conflict with other aims which might impede the fulfillment of their own desires, which distinguishes our generation. And so it's like what he's saying here. This is a lot of, again, the thesis of the chapter there. I mean, that you read, where he's like, they're too focused on their ideal ends to engage in the material reality in front of them, the conditions, and they will not, anything would even be a restraint on their immediate ambitions is just ignored or thrown to the side. And it's so reckless and so dangerous, because that's where you get into that. One of those things being ignored is often the freedoms of others, the preferences of others, their, humanity, depending on the situation. And so we just, that's really just me saying amen and amen a little bit, to what Hayek is saying here in this observation that goes to, ironically, I wasn't even thinking about this when I said it earlier, but just that hubris that we see in the people advocating for this stuff is they're like, it's Chesterton's fence a little bit. Oh, there's a fence there. There's a restraint. Let's rip it out, blow it up, man. Like, it's in our way. Like, who cares why it's there? Who cares what it is? Who cares why, if it's an opinion that another person has, who cares how they landed on that opinion or on that belief? Doesn't matter. All they see it as, it's in my way. It's in the way of my ideal end. And so it has to go. It has to go.
Yeah. You brought up Chesterton's fence there, and that's just a lesson in second order thinking. When you eliminate these economic arguments, you solve the thing, but you don't think of the second order, where it's like, all right, we've affected the thing, but how's the thing affect the other thing? And it's like, who cares? Like, if it affects the other thing negatively, guess what we have to solve it? Coercive government control is always the idea. And you wonder why this monster grows. It's like, well, this thing always affects the other thing, so we control the other thing, which affects another thing, and it just spreads that way.
Henry Hazlitt. Yeah, it's economics in one lesson. So here's a quote that I think goes, that what we just talked about dovetails nicely into. And Hayek says we must now return briefly to the crucial point, and this is the crucial point, that individual freedom cannot be reconciled with the supremacy of one single purpose to which the whole society must entirely and permanently be subordinated. I'm going to repeat that again. Is there any contemporary analogs for this? Just one. Individual freedom cannot be reconciled with the supremacy of one single purpose to which the whole society must be entirely and permanently subordinated. The only exception to the rule that a free society must not be subjected to a single purpose is war and other temporary disasters, when subordination of almost everything to the immediate and pressing need is the price at which we preserve our freedom in the long run. This explains also why so many of the fashionable phrases about doing for the purposes of peace what we have learned to do for the purposes of war are very misleading. It is sensible temporarily to sacrifice freedom in order to make it more secure in the future, but the same cannot be said for a system proposed as a permanent arrangement. And so there is a tension here where whenever you have a society where it's like you have an immediate threat, whether it's Nazis or COVID, I guess, I'm not sure that those would weigh out equally in the scale, but those are some of the arguments being made. Climate change is one of the ones we cited directly in the last episode. That there are arguments that will be made that we have to subordinate the whole of society and get rid of individual freedom to tackle this one thing. The problem is that once our modern society learned that they could do this about 100 years ago, is that we've had a mixture of times whenever that was the argument that was made, that, and perhaps even today included, where it's not applicable. It's not the same as we have to, take control of, a Singer type or Singer type sewing machine factory to make handguns or something like that, or wasn't it Maytag, which made I think Maytag that made appliances.
Yeah,
there are handguns and military equipment you could find that were made by Maytag during World War II. That's not the same as today, or the war on crime or drugs or whatever. It's just not the same. And so we're in this situation now where this is all completely correct, that there are times when society does have to say, okay, look, there is a greater threat. We need to lock arms. I call it stacking sandbags together. I might have something else I'd like to be doing more, but there's a flood right there. I got to drop what I'm doing, and we're all going to go and stack some sandbags or bond together for the greater good. But though in those instances, it's intuitive to the entire society that that's the need of the hour, right? And so, like, the problem that we get into is there are the people who say, well, yeah, it's clearly intuitive, right? This is what we all need to do. It's common sense. And you get a huge chunk of the society that's like, I don't see it that way at all. Like, not even a little bit. And then so coercion is used. But I think that point is extremely important, that individual freedom can't be reconciled with the supremacy of one single purpose for the whole society. That doesn't mean there aren't times when that's necessary, but it's few and far between. And that has been abused ad nauseum over the last 100 years after they figured out that they could do this, basically.
Nice. Yeah. You said Maytag made handguns? So
I think,
so for like an extra $500, they can get a lifetime warranty on it?
oh my gosh, I need to look it up. I know that I think it's Singer and Maytag that there are some Colt 45s that you can find. They're really valuable from World War II issue. I'll look it up while you're reading the next one.
Perfect.
That are made by sewing machine and refrigerator plants, basically.
Perfect. So yeah, I think what you read there is taken directly from, well, I mean, it's in this chapter, but it's an idea right at the beginning of the book that you can't or shouldn't use the temporary condition of war as a permanent economic solution during peacetime, unless, and of course, you remain in a perpetual state of war, which is also unsustainable. So both extremes here seem to be very, very unsustainable. But planners see a war economy as an opportunity to achieve their single purpose. And this is kind of where we get into the stuff we talked about in the previous chapter, as you even saw in the summary, how the war economy is used to transform the general economy into an order to top-down economic argument that's tough to get out of. I think what what Hayek has expanded on before about the war economy and the incentives to get into it for planners and organizers and people who want to organize society. He did not expand on, which he does a bit in this chapter, is how do you get out of it? Right? You build an economic dependency on what, well, I think he might not have, because he didn't see, like, he was going into it, right? 44 war's about to end. He's going into it. He's like, I don't know. He did, I think, expand on it in one of like the 76 preface or something like that, the new one he wrote. But it's still this difficult thing. It's just like getting someone on welfare, just a single person on welfare, and how they wean themselves off of it. It's not an easy process. It can be done for sure, but it is not an easy process. There's some pain involved with it. It's some like, oh, I got to work for the stuff that I'm getting now. This takes out of my, my leisure time. And even like, I'm not even trying to talk about like the lazy people on welfare. I'm just trying to talk about the everyday person who happens to get on welfare because they get injured or something that actually happens to them, a real world situation that gets hard to wean yourself off of it. That is how a country acts in a wartime economy. And then once the war is over, it's like, all right, the people in power aren't normally like, all right, we'll give all you, like, you can go, Maytag can go back to making, washers and dryers. It's hard to be like, all right, no, we kind of want you to make these other things for the government because we want to get, in the buy and sell trade ourselves, or it at least allows it much easier for us to control everyone else. So what he gets into next is like, how do we, I think as he puts exactly here, we must not continue the temporary condition as a permanent argument. We must find a way to overhaul and renew our industrial apparatus and organization. We need to find a way to wean the economy off of that war economy.
Yep, and it's going to be painful. It was Singer, by the way. Yeah, it was Singer sewing machines, and you can find Singer 45s. I think one of them is like a 1911 also that they made. It's cool. It has the same logo on it as a sewing machine. Nice. But the point is, that's rare. That's not every single time someone's a pet project that you get to do that. AOC.
Yeah, if they were still forced to make guns now, where would you get your sewing machines? Come on.
That's exactly right. And where would Amish people get their clothes? There is little doubt that after the war, wisdom in the management of our economic affairs will be even more important than before, and the fate of our civilization will ultimately depend on how we solve the economic problems we shall face. Let's read that last part again. The fate of our civilization will ultimately depend on how we solve the economic problems we shall face. So again, Hayek saying Nazis aren't the threat anymore. It's the planners and the totalitarians in our midst, and who's going to win the battle of ideas, which we'll get to the kind of forlorn way in which Hayek views that conflict at the end of the chapter. But he's saying that's the biggest threat to our society. He says, if we act wisely, this is what he's arguing for, there's little question that by hard work and devoting a considerable part of our efforts to overhauling and renewing their industrial apparatus and organization, they will, in the course of a couple of years, be able to return to and even to surpass that level they had reached. But this presupposes that they shall be satisfied, they being the society, Great Britain, to consume currently no more than is possible without impairing the task of reconstruction. So they have to have, some kind of, self-control, that no exaggerated hopes to create irresistible claims for more than this, and that they regard it as more important to use their resources in the best manner and for the purposes which contribute most to our well-being than that we should use all resources somehow. Perhaps no less important is that we should not, by short-sighted attempts to cure poverty by a redistribution instead of by an increase in our income, so depress large classes as to turn them into determined enemies of the existing political order. You could substitute existing political order there with liberalism, by the way. It should never be forgotten that the one decisive factor in the rise of totalitarianism on the continent, which is yet absent in this country, is the existence of a large, recently dispossessed middle class. So what Hayek is saying is is that there's actually preconditions for a swift recovery, swift being a couple years, but we can do it. We can do it. But it's going to require one kind of a deferment gratification, delayed gratification, like this wise use of their resources. And they're going to have realistic goals, again, grounded in those material conditions, i.e. reality, in order for them to do this. And he's saying we can't have any exaggerated hopes and ridiculous rhetoric injected into it by people who are just trying to seize power, who will prey on the frustrations of those who maybe are making less money after the wartime economy and haven't gotten to where they'd like to be again, or those who for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. The point is playing on the frustrations of others. There are people who are going to make these promises that they can't keep in order to get power. And Hayek's point is that if you do that, if you introduce these delusions, these ideal ends into our recovery here, you're going to end up with a dispossessed middle class, because you're going to get these people who thought that they were going to get this one thing. Oh yeah, we could take a shortcut. We don't have to have delayed gratification. We don't have to use our resources wisely. We don't have to, maybe take a pay cut for now, in order to have a better life here in 2 or 3 years. And so, yeah, let's just take the shortcut. And then when that doesn't work, as it never does, you're going to get a dispossessed middle class. And that's what breeds like socialist, revolutions, is this huge group of frustrated people. And so he's saying this will start the process all over again if you do that. So he's saying here's the preconditions, and it's up to you as to whether or not you want to do this or not. But honestly, that last part, depressing the classes and turns them into enemies of liberalism and of the existing order. That's what delusion and empty promises does. It reminds me a lot of Eric Hoffer once again. But anyway.
Yeah. It's hard to resist the temptation, I suppose, that comes with the war economy. And I'm not talking about the temptation. Well, a bit of the temptation of the workers, right? They get all this work. They get raises in many cases. They get bonuses for working overtime to get all these materials out to the battlefront to make sure that they can supply the troops. And, like I said before, you got something you got to wean yourself off of at a certain point. And it's a difficult thing to do. But if you can do it like right away, like snap, it's first day of no war, first day of peacetime. Let's start moving our temporary conditioned economy of the wartime economy into now this efficient economy that hopefully we had before. Even if you didn't have it before, all right, well, now let's take kind of what we learned and then start to build actual progress here, instead of just reverting back to this kind of planned state. And sometimes, depending on which side of the war you end up on, right, if you end up on the losing side, it's very difficult to recover, no matter what, as Germany saw it in World War One. But they took the exact opposite direction, right? They started spending a whole bunch. That sound familiar? They started, being more authoritarian. They started to move more towards nationalism. They were very, very upset with the Allies for putting all these horrible post-war conditions on them. So they ran in the exact opposite direction, which is why we got a second World War, only a few decades later. So I like that. The first part of this chapter, this is where we're going to start transitioning to kind of the next part, where we go from these wartime economic solutions or just kind of understanding this kind of collectivist behavior to the moral section. Like, he really, really expands on this kind of idea of morality in a way he hasn't done in a previous chapter, which is kind of, it was really, really nice to see, I think, to kind of get into his brain and understand, his mode of thinking as to the moral. He talks about it a bit with the moral basis versus the moral results. I think he kind of expands on it a little bit here, but I think he really gets into this. I mean, he had like a section in here that we just wanted to quote the whole thing because it was so Seriously. Good. Stream of consciousness on the idea of morality, and not even really his idea of morality. It's just the other people's idea of morality and what they're trying to sell you. And it's like, it doesn't end up the way they tell you it's going to end up. And again, it's a disconnect between the moral basis and the moral results. So the first quote we have here is quote, "Planners argue that we must learn to master the forces of society in the same manner in which we have learned to master the forces of nature. This is not the only path to totalitarianism, but the path to the destruction of our civilization and a certain way to block future progress." So I think in this brilliant quote is there are two false assumptions here. One, the first false assumption is that we ever truly mastered nature. I don't think we've ever done that. And then two, that we can master the forces of society, even as an additional, even if we did master nature. But the reason why I don't think we've done either of these is because these are not inseparable. Like these are connected together, and we can't master the forces of society because We haven't mastered the forces of human nature. Like, don't even talk about how we've tried to master the forces, like you brought up before we started talking, mastered kind of, the forces of the hurricane to make sure we can make sure we're not, flooding our streets during bad weather or something like that, mastering the natural forces out there, but we haven't even mastered the forces of human nature. And when we try, as I put down here, is when we try riding a wild horse without taming it first, it's not going to end well. And that's effectively what we're doing here, is we believe that we already surpassed this whole idea. We understand human nature. We're blank slates. We can kind of program people to do whatever we want, to believe whatever we want, and to act how we want. So now the next part is just putting the experts in, as we said in the last review, having the experts kind of run it in an efficient manner, just like, a lab experiment. And the problem is we just haven't mastered any of these forces they talked about yet. So goes back into the humility thing. It's like we don't have enough humility to understand what we don't understand, or to admit what we don't understand. And then we're just going to jump into the next thing. We're just going to go to the next level and try that out and hope it gets okay. It's okay this time, right? Because it's never been tried, right? So we'll hope it goes right this time.
Yeah. And I think that fundamental neglect of human nature, or naive assumption that we somehow have mastered nature or anything like that. Yeah, before we got started, I was like, how's that working for New Orleans? Like, how's it working? There's an ice storm in Texas. Like, no, we haven't mastered nature. Like, we are continually in submission to nature. And it is very humbling. That's why I think, by the way, as an aside, everyone should spend time outdoors, camping in tough situations, just for humility, to be like, okay, I am not the master of my own universe as much as I thought I was. So here's a quote that really gets into the morals of it, and Hayek's just observations here. Like I said, this isn't his morals or anything that he's projecting. He's just making observations about human nature, and the material conditions of human nature and history versus the idealized, like, delusional version of human nature and morality as posited by the planners in his society, the totalitarians in his midst. He says, it is, however, more than doubtful whether a 50 years approach towards collectivism has raised our moral standards, or whether the change has not been in the opposite direction. Though we are in the habit of priding ourselves on our more sensitive social conscience, it is by no means clear that this is justified by the practice of our individual conduct. There's a sentence that could be taken today. It's like, we pride ourselves on how sensitive we are, as a society, how sensitive our conscience is.
Yeah, I'm offended for you. Like, so
yeah, being really sensitive. It's not really clear on whether or not it's a justified pride when it comes to the behavior of individuals. In other words, he says, on the negative side, in its indignation about the inequities of the existing social order, our generation probably surpasses most of its predecessors. But the effect of that movement on our positive standards in the proper field of morals, individual conduct, and on the seriousness with which we uphold moral principles against the expediencies and exigencies of social machinery is a very different matter. So he's saying, it's to say that we're more sensitive to evil and more sensitive to human suffering is not to say that as individuals we have become better about addressing that or taking action on an individual basis to alleviate that. And that the move towards collectivism, in fact, has probably taken our moral standards as individuals in the opposite direction, despite the fact that we have a rhetoric that is now more sensitive to, suffering. Our individual action, our individual morality has clearly went in the opposite direction.
Yeah. I think what he brings up here at the indignation, I think we've developed a great sense of moral indignation, right? We have a better sense than the previous generation, which I don't think is a bad thing. Like, being sensitive can be a bad thing, can be a good thing, depending on the context and how you use it. But I think he's right here that our moral indignation our sense of it has been heightened, meaning you can more easily identify problems in our society more now than ever. Like, we understand inequalities, we can identify them easier because we have the data, at our fingertips to understand it, but we don't have a great sense of how to solve those problems in a moral fashion, right? Like, we don't use our morals to continue the idea of problem solving. And that is where you see that disconnect between moral basis and moral results. We are willing we have the ability to identify this most of the time immoral thing, but then we just drop. It's like, all right, use our morality for this. Let's drop morality and let's use problem solve, doing by any means necessary, right? And as the quoted several chapters ago, I'm paraphrasing, but the quote, by any means necessary to a moral person is everything but moral. Like you can't, that goes against morality, because if you're willing to use any means necessary, you're going to use means that are immoral. And normally those immoral means are shortcuts, unfortunately.
Yep. Yeah. Whenever you hear by any means necessary, that's the ends justify the means. Yeah. And not an argument that moral people usually will buy into. And Hayek goes on to say that, in that kind of continuation, he's just making observations here. There is much to suggest that we have, in fact, become more tolerant towards particular abuses and much more indifferent to inequities in individual cases, since we have fixed our eyes on an entirely different system in which the state will set everything right. It may even be, as has been suggested, that the passion for collective action is a way in which we now, without conjunction, collectively indulge in that selfishness, which as individuals we had learned a little to restrain. So he's saying, like, look, the fact that we are now focused on the government, like the state setting everything right here, we have taken ourselves off the hook. I think one of the things in our conclusion is that collectivism is just wide-scale societal bystander effect. I don't have to do it. I don't have to do any of this. And because of that, I become tolerant in that situation under collectivism of particular abuses. Like, I think that, again, Curtis Yarvin has that great interview with Michael Malice he did a couple weeks ago, where he talks about just how accustomed people in these big cities have become to just wide-scale human indignity, and how you can see massive, like someone like taking a dump on the sidewalk and shooting up outside of like a Louis Vuitton store or something like that in LA or San Francisco. And it's like the fact that people become numb to that is insane. It's insane. Like, if I saw, in my town, if we saw someone who was doing that, who had lost their mind, or was, like, we would call someone, we would be like, okay, what can we do about this? Whatever. But the community I live in isn't really collectivist oriented. It's more of an individualistic community. And he's saying that whenever the state becomes a thing that you can put in your mind as, someone ought to do something, well, surely the state will do something, you let yourself off the hook and you become tolerant of abuse and human dignities in a way. And as such, you give yourself permission to indulge in selfishness that previously you probably would have tamped down a little bit on. But now you don't have to, because you don't have to worry about being selfish, because the state will be selfless for you, which means you get to be selfish, because the state, you've said, no, look, I support this beautiful thing here. And so I don't have to be selfless. I am selfless by dint of me just saying that I support this thing.
Yeah. We're gonna get to another Milton quote that I think really takes that idea and runs with it. But I think it's the idea that collectivism takes the responsibility of moral action and moral behavior away from the individual, because they believe the collective must act morally more generally overall. This allows the individual to feel more safe acting immorally from time to time, as long as the collective sees itself as acting more moral than immoral, something we'll get to a little bit later. This begins the slow slide of the individual into subjective morality. And the other major issue with the idea of collective morality is its demand for virtue, or what the planners at least see as virtue, through compulsion. This is where we get to another quote by John Milton, quote, if every action which is good or evil in a man of ripe years were under pittance and prescription and compulsion, what were virtue but a name? What praise should then be due to well-doing, well-gramercy, to sober, just, or continent? So here he's saying virtue isn't a virtue when you're forced to act in a certain way, right? This is the idea, I know the Christian idea of, like, when you give when you give charity, don't put your name on charity because you're defeating the whole purpose, right?
Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing.
Exactly.
Yep.
But planners think it is virtuous to force people to care about the collective whole. The left thinks it is virtuous to force people to do things the left believes is best for the environment. Socialist thinks it is virtuous to force people to give their money to the poor. These acts, even if given for good reasons, are virtueless when not acted on freely. And that's where you completely abandon virtue there. And even though, again, it might result in some good things, you'll end up, I mean, there's no humility toward it. There's no gratitude toward it. And there's no virtue in that. It's completely absent of virtue, actually.
Yeah. Just one of the things that makes me think of is collective responsibility leads to an erosion of individual responsibility. And the same goes with morality, which is one of the big themes here. Collective morality leads to an erosion of individual morality. They're not compatible. And one of the ways that Hayek, I think, even introduced that Milton quote is he said, the members of a society who in all respects are made to do the good thing have no title to praise. And so he's not arguing against laws that make you do the good thing, but instead he's simply saying, like, whenever it's something that's more abstract, like a do your part kind of thing, or, the greater good or common welfare or whatever, in that situation, like, it's not actually morality, it's coercion, as you alluded to. But yeah, the point is that I don't think collective morality and individual morality are compatible. I don't think that they can exist. The only way in which you would ever end up with a collective morality is if you happen to have a society that was comprised of moral individuals, so that you could say the sum total of that society of individuals happened to be a moral society. But it wouldn't be through collectivism. It would be through individualism. And then that's just a description, not a method. But
yeah, if we can't freely choose to do this moral thing, it's going to remain ineffective. And this is next what gets into, quote, can there be much doubt that the feeling of personal obligation to remedy inequities where our individual power permits has been weakened rather than strengthened? That both the willingness to bear responsibility and the consciousness that is our own individual duty to know how to choose have been perceptibly impaired. When we maintain our liberties, we then have the ability to remedy inequities in our own personal capacity. When we give our liberty to a large coercive power, we lose our abilities to affect change in our own personal capacity. We are beholden to the people who made the promises, right? All these politicians making promises that no longer need to keep those once the checks and balances are removed. Once these people have power, as we see every single day, right? Biden said, why would I ever have a mask mandate? Why would I ever mandate vaccines? That was right when he got elected. Now look what's happening, right? He already has the power. So what's the incentive of keeping his promise? I don't think he's running for another term, but to take it out of just the American political space, you have the power to affect change in your own personal capacity when you maintain your liberties, right? But when you give away those liberties, you no longer have that power. So if you want to, help improve poverty, okay, I can do that in my own personal capacity. I can work, to try to build up, the poor in my community. There's plenty of different things you do in your own personal capacity. But when you end up going to the government and say, I want this thing to be done, you can do it if I give you my liberties, if I give you more power. Okay, well, then it ends up being very ineffective when they're like, you know what, we want to help the poor, but right now our priority is on COVID. And on all these different things. So we'll get to you eventually. It's a promise not kept, but now that power is gone. Now you don't have the individual personal capacity to affect that change. You've already given it up.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, again, here, this is Hayek. I mean, he's asking a question, and this is him making observations where he says, feelings of personal obligation to remedy inequities, like, have they gone up or gone down under collectivism, basically? And it's a rhetorical question in a lot of ways, but he's like, I think, saying what you just said quite beautifully, which is that whenever you give up your liberty and your freedom to do things to affect change positively, then you give up your responsibility to be part of that as well. And I think responsibility is a thing that it's also I think an emotional burden, and I mean that in a positive way. like we have responsibilities to our family, we have responsibilities to our relationships, and so on and so forth.
It's supposed
and there's
to
a
be.
burden there. Yeah, exactly. It's supposed to be, and it's good. It helps remind us that the world isn't about us. It doesn't revolve around us. That we have responsibilities to others that we've chosen, by the way. That's what, well, not necessarily with our family, but with our spouse and our friends and so on and so forth. But whenever you give up your personal liberty, then you don't have a responsibility to those things anymore. And it's really, it's sad. And then Hayek is saying, like, you can look at so much through this chapter that it's contrasting. Has morality gone up or has it gone down? Has individual responsibility towards suffering gone up or has it gone down? Has your personal obligation to do things about inequities or suffering, has it gone up or gone down? So there's that contrast. It's like the material conditions in front of us, what we've seen in the past are, we engage with reality as individuals and we have a responsibility to it and we can actually affect change. And under this, delusional utopian thing where we give up and abdicate responsibility, has things gotten better or not? And Hayek is saying, well, probably not. One of the things here that I think is really, really good, he says, or not good, but it's an excellent observation. He says, as the rules of conduct evolved by individuals are the source from which collective political action derives what moral standards it possesses, it would indeed be surprising if the relaxation of the standards of individual conduct were accompanied by a raising of standards of social action. So I'll read that again. So he's saying, as the rules of conduct evolved by individuals are the source from the collective political action that where it derives its moral standards, right? He's saying it'd be surprising if relaxing the standards in the individual, which is the source of the moral standards, saying if you relax those standards, it would be really surprising if that was accompanied by a raising of standards of social action, which is exactly what I was just saying, is that he's contrasting these things. Like, whenever you do this here, this is what happens. Whenever we did this, what happened here? Like, how do you see it? How do you see it? But again, he's saying, like, whenever individual accountability becomes secondary to some vaguely defined collective or something like that, or social responsibility, it doesn't make sense to assume that the circumstances are going to make higher standards of individual moral conduct as opposed to lower. And again, I think that you can see a pretty big through line just from the erosion of our American cities as they become more and more beholden to leftist politics and politicians who are going to do, solve the problems and do everything for you and implement all these programs. Like, has morality, in an objective sense. I'm not even saying like in some like subjective religious thing, but has like the standards, of life gone up or down? Have things gotten better or worse? Are people more responsible in their actions or less responsible in their actions for themselves and for their community? I think it's obvious that the answer isn't in the negative for all of those things. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I read that quote, it did remind me that the bystander effect, that basically when you're alone and with someone else and someone falls over, you feel obligated to go and help them up. And in fact, you normally do. But when you're in a crowd and someone falls over, it's kind of like, well, someone else will help them, right? So I don't need to rush there, or I don't feel like I have the responsibility to go over there. And it's this collective morality that acts as that moral shield.
Yep.
You don't feel like when you're in the crowd, it's like, why do I have to act moral? I'm sure plenty of other people are acting moral. So net moral benefit, right? And so that is how you corrupt a collective morality, which is why you should really never rely on collective morality.
Yep.
And like you said, it's like you degrade and lower the standards of the individual. Well, what is a collective made of, right? Of individuals, unless they're just a bunch of bots and widgets that all act the same, which some people think people do.
Clearly, you've never been to San Francisco.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, that kind of proves the point, right? Yep. It's probably not moral to let people defecate on the streets and do some of the horrible things they do, but they think it's moral because, hey, at least you're not throwing homeless people in jail, or at least you're not taking their drugs away from them. That would be immoral. Not they like paying people to not. I heard something silly about them paying like $300 if you don't shoot someone, or that's something in Chicago. There's some sort of weird law that's like you're paying people to not commit crimes. All that being said, I'm probably going to be moving there because I haven't committed really any crimes yet that they know of.
There you go.
Make some profit.
But
right?
Since you can get away with it in Chicago, I mean, kind of
Right.
might want to, anyway. Yep. So sorry, I was just thinking about, I was trying to think of like what policy you would even be talking about. Like, okay, they're paying people to not commit crime.
Yeah,
Okay.
I heard it from like Knowles
That'd be a huge
and
departure from most leftist policies where they actually are paying people to commit crimes.
well, they figure that works, you know. Maybe the other
Yeah.
one works. I think it was like
Um,
Clavin who said it. He's like, I'll go over there, get paid.
so this is where I think the next part is where he gets into logical progression of these things, because there is some serious societal consequences to relaxing individual morality and individual responsibility to your fellow citizens. And so he's getting into this and like what happens to groups, in groups, out groups, whatever, whenever people don't feel a responsibility to each other or feel an individual responsibility to a morality. And he says discrimination between members and non-members of closed groups is accepted more and more as a matter of course. Injustices inflicted on individuals by government action in the interest of a group are disregarded with an indifference hardly distinguishable from callousness. And the grossest violation of the most elementary rights of the individual, such as are involved in the compulsory transfer of populations, are more and more countenanced by supposed liberals. All this surely indicates that our moral sense has been blunted rather than sharpened. When we are reminded, as more and more frequently happens, that one cannot make omelets without breaking eggs, the eggs which are broken are almost all the kind which a generation or two ago were regarded as the essential bases of civilized life. And what atrocities committed by powers with whose professed principles they sympathized have not been readily condoned by many of our so-called liberals. And so this idea of sliding into a place where you are okay with human rights violations or just the general denigration of human dignity, whether it's by the state, he says injustices inflicted on individuals by government action in the interest of a group are disregarded. I don't think it has to just be government, but I think that is a relevant one. I think the vaccine mandate stuff is obviously a contemporary analog for that. It says it's indistinguishable from callousness, where it's like, I don't have a responsibility to you. And if you, because here's the thing. So I support X action or X government entity, right? So I support government A or policy proposal A. And that to me is actually how I fulfill, or at least my diluted perspective is how I fulfill a moral obligation to society, not through my individual action, but through that. So I've tethered my sense of morality and goodness to support of that or the people proposing that. Well, what happens when someone disagrees with me on that? I've already drawn a straight line between individual goodness and morality and just a good person and that thing. So if they disagree, they're not good. They're not like me. They don't care about doing the right thing or any sense of morality. And again, once you have given yourself, once you've decided that the outgroup is immoral, you get all types of license to treat them however you want, and you become indifferent to any type of indignities against them because they're the bad guys. So why would you care? It's like, we have this good moral thing. They're not interested in the good moral thing. So we can do whatever we want with them because they're opposed to morality and righteousness and goodness. And this idea of, oh, well, you gotta break a few eggs to make an omelet. And Hayek is saying here, it's like, yeah, but those things that we're okay with breaking now, we would have said are the essential bases of civilized life a few generations ago. That individual responsibility to each other, the recognition of basic human decency, regardless of our views. That used to be how we saw things. But now that we've moved away from individual morality to collective, that has consequences. And that's one of the things he's outlining here is being okay with discrimination and injustices imposed on individuals by government or other actors because they're part of the outgroup. That's where collectivism leads.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that section of the quote where I ironically actually had this section highlighted in a different spot in our outline, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to repeat this twice, but combined it in here. But the part where he says, quote, one cannot make omelets without breaking eggs. The eggs which are broken are almost all of a kind which a generation or two ago were regarded as essential basis of civilized life. It was not long ago where we valued many of the things that we actively try to rid ourselves today in society: competition, high standards, humility, meritocracy, monetary success, and the list goes on and on. We actively try to expel these things to achieve some sense of equality of outcome or inclusion. It is us completely rejecting, and it gets into a little bit in the next quote, but is us actively rejecting everything that has built up this successful society, this prosperous civilization that can export all of these wonderful ideas to the rest of the world. We actively reject those, and we can't expect something different to come out other than the degradation of our culture and the decadence we're going to see of the modern civilization, if we don't end up, not rejecting everything that we see here. Which brings us to the next quote. Quote, but almost all the traditions and institutions in which British moral genius has found its most characteristic expression, and which in turn have molded the national character and the whole moral climate of England, are those which the progress of collectivism and its inherently centralistic tendencies are progressively destroying. To put it simply here, collectivism is a parasite which eventually drains and kills the host. It is an infection. That's why I like the Gadsad idea of the parasitic mind. It's a parasite. It's a corrupt idea. It's a corruption in the system. It's a bug in your computer, if you will. It actively changes the code for certain functions to do something that it's not supposed to do, which corrupts the whole system as a whole and will slowly bring down the whole system. This is this idea of collectivism is. He calls socialism a species of collectivism. I like the species language there because it's organic. It's something different. It grows on its own. It almost has its own mind. When people get this idea in their head and they start getting on the track of, oh, this is a good idea, let's explore it. Now you've opened up the floodgates to say, oh, wow, there's all kinds of awful things, or well, all kinds of lovely things I want to accomplish by horrible, awful means. And he said so many times before, we often end up doing, even the socialists and collectivists themselves end up doing things that they find morally reprehensible under the guise of do something at all costs, do this thing, achieve this goal at all costs. Because it's just this parasitic relationship where it ends up eating away at its host, even when the host, wants this collective ideology to infect its economy and its society.
Yeah, one of the things that makes me think of when he said socialism is a species, it's also like the movie Species, where it makes you feel good for a hot second and then it murders you. Anyone unfamiliar with that stupid 90s horror movie? Yeah, so one of the things that it drains from the host, that this parasite, that this collectivist ideology drains. Actually, James Lindsay talks about this, where how critical theory, which is of course very much that, planning, it's all part of that same socialist thing, is he says they drain your moral authority and your epistemic authority. So your moral sensibilities and your ability to know what is going on. But one of the things I'd add to that, especially in Hayek's context, is it destroys their immune system, in that, like, your immune system is how your body defends itself from hostile, like, foreign entities, right? Not all foreign entities are hostile. Like, it's good for you to have like a good, healthy gut, that we're learning more and more about their biome. It's
natural immunity thing that can happen.
That's a conspiracy theory.
Oh, I forgot. Kicked off of YouTube.
But one of the things that it does is it destroys their immune system. It destroys their desire, their ability to defend themselves against any outside attacks by draining that moral authority, I think. And it's really sad, to be honest. And this is where he kind of gets into this topic of propaganda. And propaganda, by the way, for some reason I put the definition of this at the end of the conversation, but propaganda is information or ideas that are deliberately spread just to help or harm. Could be a group, a person, a movement, or a country, right? So it's just ideas that are spread with a purpose, and it could be a good purpose, it could be a bad purpose. So when we hear propaganda today, and I use propaganda in a negative sense to describe a lot of the corporate press that we see today. But there are good versions of propaganda, even just in a contemporary context. One example is there are groups who are trying to broadcast radio signals into North Korea to let them know what's outside of North Korea about freedom, for example. And that's a propaganda, but it's a good propaganda that they're trying to spread. In Hayek's context, there was propaganda. There was a propaganda war. There was Great Britain was trying to spread propaganda into Germany, and behind the German, the enemy lines, to try and get people to understand that Nazism was wrong and broken. And Germans were doing the same thing. Germans were dumping propaganda all over London, saying surrender, like you're screwed. But propaganda isn't inherently a bad thing. It's just ideas with a purpose to help or harm, a group or movement or country. And so I think this next part here, if you're just thinking about propaganda, maybe, I don't know, one thing we could substitute it for is just like supportive information. That's kind of clunky. But Hayek is saying, like, well, I'll just read the quote and then maybe we can get into it here. But there's something here that I really don't want people to get hung up on the word propaganda. And so whatever you need to substitute it for, do that. But don't think of this in a negative sense. But Hayek says the first prerequisite for success in propaganda directed to other people is the proud acknowledgement of the characteristic values and distinguishing traits for which the country attempting it is known to the other peoples. So he's saying, like, what is necessary for successful propaganda is for people to associate that propaganda with the country and see it as true. They need to see it as true or believable. Okay. He says the main cause of the ineffectiveness of British propaganda is that those directing it seem to have lost their own belief in the peculiar values of English civilization, or to be completely ignorant of the main points on which it differs from that of other people. The left intelligentsia, indeed, have so long worshipped foreign gods that they seem to have become almost incapable of seeing any good in the characteristic English institutions or traditions. The moral values on which most of them pride themselves are largely the product of institutions they are out to destroy. These socialists, of course, cannot admit. So he's saying, like, in order for us to, the reason why our propaganda is, he calls it fatuous and ineffective. Like, the reason why it's ineffective is because it's obvious that we don't even believe this. The people who are spreading it don't even believe it, or they don't understand it, or they don't see why it's good or true. And this is something I made a post about this on my locals and a few other places yesterday, that after we got done working on this outline, it literally brought tears to my eyes, because I was thinking about, because I was looking at stuff after 9/11 and seeing our country's response, and about how, like, we did come together, and how it's like, fuck you, we're stronger than this. Like, you just poked the bear. Like, whatever you think about Iraq or Afghanistan, and I have very strong opinions about, just how much we were misled and the way the war machine organized there. But there was a national sense of, you mess with the wrong group of people. And especially, it's the only time I've ever envied New Yorkers. If you look at how they came together and how they were so wounded and said, no, we are stronger than this. We are stronger than this. We have values that are superior to your values. We have a way of life that is superior to your way of life. And this attack was proof of that. It was proof of that, not an indictment of that idea. And if you compare that to today, I was thinking, I'm like, there's not even a good analog for this. I could not come up with a modern example of some mainstream entity or institution that was actively espousing American exceptionalism, or just the superiority of the American experiment and our Western ideals and the values and principles laid down in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. We don't even have that. We don't even have that. And so that's one reason why, like, we are so vulnerable to outside ideas, because we don't have any sense of who we are and what we stand for, at least as a nation. There are certainly areas of this country and in other places. I think Douglas Murray writes beautifully about this in The Strange Death of Europe, a similar notion of just losing a sense of self as a nation and as a collective of nations in Europe. And how that makes you vulnerable to these other ideas. That's that your immune system being weakened. There was a long time ago, by that I mean maybe 3 or 4 years ago, someone wanted me to review this video on postmodernism that someone else had made, and all they talked about was deconstructionism. And one of the critiques I gave was that it's not, postmodernism isn't just, at least in our contemporary context, isn't just about deconstructing. It's about deconstructing for the purpose of like creating a vacant lot to construct something in its place. And the example I gave is that when you see like those big wrecking balls in a city that are going to tear down a skyscraper, or you see them actively tearing down a building, one of the first thoughts you have is, oh, I wonder what they're going to build in its place. You don't just think about the deconstruction, but you think about what's going to go up to replace it. And that's what this ideology does. That's what collectivism does. That's what we have seen it do. That's why I can't think of one single freaking example. And please put it in the comments if you can think of one, of a mainstream entity espousing American exceptionalism without apologizing for it or making some type of addendum of America was built on slavery or white supremacy or some bullshit notion like that. We don't have it. And what that does is it creates a huge vacuum to be filled in its place, where it's like, yeah, I guess I'm open to that. Why not? Green New Deal this or this thing, or 1619 project that, because I don't have a counter in my mind. It's not like, well, but I thought we were doing this thing. I thought we stood for this. How does that compatible with my pre-existing set of values? Well, once you get rid of the pre-existing set of values, once you get rid of anything that makes you uniquely, in Hayek's case, uniquely British or uniquely English, then you're vulnerable to a whole host of insidious and destructive ideas because you've lost your sense of self. And I really see that in our today's context, man. I really do. But the point is that if you're going to spread effective propaganda, it needs to be believable. In order for it to be believable, they have to see that you mean it and that there's actually some there. And Hayek was saying, look, we're too busy apologizing for our civilization to convince anyone in Germany that it's something they should believe in.
Yeah. I think we're going to get to the apologetic aspect toward the end, which he puts it beautifully. But
sorry, spoiler alert.
God, spoilies. But I think our inability to come up with an institution that is still espousing American exceptionalism is a red flag for our decadent society. It's a common theme in a decadent society to reject, like I said, everything that has come before, because we no longer stand up for American exceptionalism. We are effectively abandoning the American dream, which is the true sad part. And Hayek does go on to explain how this is happening in Britain, actually. So, quote, if the English themselves abandon the supreme ideal of the freedom and happiness of the individual, if they implicitly admit that their civilization is not worth preserving and that they know nothing better than to follow the path along which the Germans have led, they have indeed nothing to offer. This seems to happen in all decadent civilizations. They no longer care for or outright reject the values that made them prosperous, made them influential, allowed them to export ideas like England used to, like America somewhat continues to do, but it is barely dripping out these new ideas to export. This is how England went from, like I said, the exporter ideas to importer ideas, and this is what's happening to America today. When we abandon all of those characteristics that we found and picked up and grew on the road to freedom, and we abandon that road completely, which seems like what we're doing. That's why it's the road to serfdom. You're abandoning the road that took you here, that got us to this place, and we're starting to reverse directions into a deeper, darker place that without these values, the people espousing them are really, really not going to like.
Yep. Yeah. I don't really have any thoughts on that, but I agree. Yeah, I was pulling. Sorry about that. I was pulling this other quote that I wanted to put in here, and I'll just go ahead and read it. That kind of hammers that home, and then I'll read this next quote. Hayek, he's talking about Germans, and he says they might be convinced that the way they've chosen was wrong, but nothing will ever convince them that the British will be better guides on the German path. And so that just hammers it home, where he's like, if they draw the conclusion that what they're doing is wrong, it won't be because of us. And so the next quote, either way, is he says, if we're to succeed in the war of ideologies and to win over the decent elements, So I'm going to start that over again. If we're to succeed in the war of ideologies and to win over the decent elements in the enemy countries, we must first of all regain the belief in the traditional values for which this country stood in the past. We must have the moral courage stoutly to defend the ideals which our enemies attack, not by shamefaced apologies and assurances that we are rapidly reforming, doing better. We're doing better, right? Got to do better. Not by explaining that we are seeking some compromise between traditional English values and the new totalitarian ideas, shall we win confidence and support. Not the latest improvements we may have effected in our social institutions, which count, but little compared with the basic differences of two opposed ways of life. But our unwavering faith in those traditions which have made this country a free and upright, tolerant and independent people is the thing that counts. Unwavering. It's like, I don't owe you a German Nazi. I don't owe you an explanation for this. It goes without saying that every country is imperfect. So I don't have to add that, right? I don't owe you an explanation. We are a country whose traditions have made us free and upright and tolerant and independent people. And that's what counts. We are better than you. We are better than you. You could be like this too. You could have. It's not a uniquely English thing any more than Nazism is a uniquely German thing. It's just which ideas are you choosing to submit yourselves to? Those of tolerance and individual liberty and freedom, or those of collectivism and abdication of responsibility and totalitarianism. That the choice is simple. But he's saying if we're going to win the war of ideas, we can't have these mealy-mouthed apologies for this society that made us wonderful in the first place. We can't do that. We have to have a strong immune response to these cancerous ideas attempting to infect us. And the only way you do that is by, you can't get so up your ass with pride in your country that you don't want to reform it, for sure. But by also saying, no, we're great. We're great. We've done an amazing thing for the world. Like, so, and no one's done it better than us, or very few have done it better than us. If you were to rank order the countries that had a positive impact on the world and those who had a negative impact on the world, you better believe we'd be on the top of that freaking list. And so, and we don't have to apologize for that. And we don't have to make concessions to Nazism in order to do that. But my point is that same sentence at the end there, you could say the same thing here, is that we have to have an unwavering faith in the traditions that have made this country a country of free and upright, tolerant, independent people. We have to have an unwavering faith in that and pride in that. We have to have an American pride. That was the other thing. Honestly, thinking about freedom fries is one of the main things that set me off. I'm like, our stupid like hatred of the French and saying freedom fries instead of French fries and being okay with that. I'm like, no, fuck you, France.
Well, and the ignorance behind it, that French fries are not from France.
Oh, I know. I totally agree. But I'm saying at least there, there's an agreement of like, no, we're freedom fries, like there's something there that's like, even as silly and ignorant as you accurately point out, that it's like, there's something beautiful about that, where it's like, when you get some leeway to be ignorant and arrogant whenever you're awesome, you do. You were talking about Gad Sad earlier. My brother DM'd me about how he read some of the Parasitic Mind, and he's like talking about how Gad Sad's was being an arrogant asshole or something like that. And I'm like, well, when you're right about this stuff, you can be a little, you can be sarcastic and facetious. Like you don't want to do it to the degree that it's going to be more counterproductive than productive, but like you get a little bit of leeway. Like Patrick Mahomes can be a little arrogant, right? Tom Brady can be a little arrogant because they earned it. And there is something to pride that is necessary as a proper defense against some of those cancerous ideas. I think I'll end it here. James Lindsay talked about this once a while ago about how someone was talking about conquistadors to someone who was from Spain and about racism, and they had all this pride in Spain and they completely shut it down. They're like, no, how dare you? What are you talking about? Like, and that sense of national pride in their history, and not going to apologize for, conquistadors, and the same thing that a lot of other countries did in terms of like colonialism and imperialism. Like, no. And it shut it down. And there is something to that, that at least to outside, that person obviously in a conversation with someone who wasn't a bad actor would say, yeah, conquistadors weren't great. But to a bad actor, you don't owe an explanation. And that's where Hayek is saying here. To Nazis, we don't owe an explanation. Because you're a bad actor. You can't be trusted to have that conversation. So my answer is a middle finger to you. And you kind of have to have a little bit of that when dealing with these ideas. You have to have that strong immune response in terms of that pride in what made your country great.
Well put. We must have moral courage stoutly to defend the ideals which our enemies attack, not by shamefaced apologies and by assurances that we are rapidly reforming, not by explaining that we are seeking some compromise between traditional English values, whatever American values, whatever you want to throw in there, well, whatever positive values you want to throw in there, and the new totalitarian ideas. Shall we win confidence and support? This is a message that all conservatives and real liberals should be reading right before bedtime every single night. Stop apologizing. This is what we talked about before. I think it was an Ember conversation. We talked about the load-bearing structures of society. One of them is comedy, and how do like comedians like get back on top and stop like getting canceled for every little thing. Stop apologizing. Don't apologize for being funny. Don't apologize for doing your job. Don't apologize for being subversive. It's your job. Keep doing it. You're doing it well. If people are attacking you, that means you're doing it really well, more likely than not. And we got to stop telling people, like you said before, that we will do better every single time you're shamed for your beliefs. That is silly nonsense. You need to stand up courageously and confidently for your beliefs, because when you say we will do better, this is some fake humility that ends up as some public self-castration that never worked out for anyone. It literally, no one who's ever apologized publicly for incidents like these, it's never worked out for them ever. No. It doesn't work. When we must stand up and have the moral courage, or as Gatzad says, the testicular fortitude, and show we truly believe in the values and traditions that led to our prosperity and moral foundation. I love how he ends this chapter. I wish you like end the book. I mean, we get to the end of the book, but this is like the perfect message. Do not apologize for being uniquely American. I don't like it. That's to me, when everyone criticized Trump, so like, oh, America thinks we're a joke. Who cares? Who the hell cares what any country other than America thinks of America? Nobody should care. When you're on top, there's always going to be haters, right? And we need to be unapologetic. Well, as long as we're not doing ignorant stuff that is explicitly anti-American, I think a lot of Biden stuff, a lot of people are showing that they're like, oh, wow, we really, really respect America now. But behind the scenes are like, oh, yeah, these pushovers. This is going to be, China's like, yeah, we're just going to cancel girly men and, do everything the opposite they're doing. And it's going to be totalitarian and awful for their people, but it's going to make them look strong on the world stage. And they're unapologetic about it. Now that's taking an example of someone who's doing awful, immoral, reprehensible things and doing it, but still, it still stands. Like, you got to be confident in what your beliefs are, and you got to stop apologizing. You got to stop, as he says, rapidly reforming to make it seem like you're not as extreme as they say you are, and stop explaining and compromising. Just stand up for what you believe. Have that testicular fortitude to sit. It's standing in the pocket. What Mahomes does really well. Stand in the pocket, and you gotta face those 300-pound linemen coming at you in order to get the ball downfield with Travis Kelce, so I can get more fantasy points.
You got Kelce?
Yes, I have Kelce. I'm one of my.
That's it. Leagues. That's it. That's an excellent. Okay, excellent pickup. Yeah, and one thing that I think is important to note here is that apology is an acknowledgement of change. And what I mean by that is it's an acknowledgement of the necessity of change. I'm sorry I did this means I should have done something different. And so the best apologies, even you can just use this in your contemporary relationships, or, your personal relationships. I mean, is if you get into a conflict with someone and you find out you did something wrong, and they say, hey, whenever you say this or do this or whatever, it really hurts my feelings. You say, I'm sorry. And if it's a good apology, it'll be something like, I'm going to try not to do that anymore. I want to avoid doing that thing that hurt you, or I want to do this other thing that you wish I do more, or whatever. And so apologies come with concessions, and concessions aren't always a bad thing if it's in a trusted, like a relationship built on trust. And why you don't apologize to bad actors is because you don't make concessions to bad actors, because you don't yield to the whims of those bad actors, because the concessions they're going to ask you to make can't be trusted. They're not going to be good they're not going to be about the good of the relationship and the inside of that, again, that personal thing. It's going to be about them and their goals. And that's why you don't apologize to the mob. If you did something to hurt someone, you apologize to them. That's the right and moral thing to do. That gets to that individual accountability and
that's the part where I was just going to bring up. But also, don't apologize to people you don't want an apology to.
That's exactly right.
It's a big thing, because like Louis C.K. is a really good, just a real quick aside, Louis C.K. is a really good example of this. He owed some people an apology, 100%. He did not owe us as a public an apology. He should have came out and said, I apologize to the people I wronged. I did a horrible thing to them. Screw you guys. I owe you nothing, public. And then continue to be famous.
That's right. And that's why, like, within these situations, you have to have that discernment. And you don't, just because the point I was trying to make is having that national sense of pride. It means that you keep, it doesn't mean you disregard the need for reform or disregard the need for growth. It means that those are conversations that are had with people that you trust and who have the same goals, right? You don't, someone who has, like, maybe, let's say there was a criticism that was offered up by bad actors in some case, and they're only wanting to use it for, some negative thing. It's like, that might be right, but I'm not going to apologize to you. And because I don't want the concession or the whatever the change is that comes from a sincere apology to be rooted in your goals. I'm gonna have that conversation with people that actually want something good for this country and want something good here. And so that's the difference. And so we have to get back to that place where we're saying we're not going to apologize for being America, right? That's not the same as saying slavery was awesome or something like that. It's like, we're just not going to apologize for being one of the bajillion countries that had slaves. It's like, okay, get over it. Look at, and I stand by that. It's like, people have to either collectively do something about every single thing that was slavery, every country, including like Germanic countries and whatever else, and Europeans who were slaves in the Muslim slave trade, or we have to collectively get over it and move forward. We just do. And so, like, that's what I mean by that is there has to be consistency, and it has to be engaged with good actors. And that's how you have a proper immune response to those criticisms and to those, I guess outside attacks.
Yeah. The appropriate immune response to slavery is not to apologize for something you cannot change nor take part in. The appropriate response is humility. Like saying, we were capable, the great of a country as we were capable of awful things. We believe in not doing that again. We believe in not repeating those mistakes. The best way to do it is through, individual liberty, because why the hell would they want to enslave people if they just care about themselves? And so, don't apologize. And the proper immune response right there is something we always forget about, which is
humility. And get over it is not condoning that evil thing. It's saying, look at how far we've come from that, especially compared to other countries, right? Like, how are other countries that had prolific slave trades doing compared to us, right? And so it's like, you measure things from like their progression and where they once were. This is where history is important, is measuring how are we doing compared to 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 80 years ago, 180 years ago, 280 years ago, and so on and so forth. And having that of like that, perspective, I guess, is what I mean by that. And so, but you're right. Yeah. Humility is a thing that you can only do in terms, at least the action side of it, with good actors, because you will be exploited by bad actors whenever you do that. And there's obviously a lot of asterisks there on personal levels. I'm just talking about as a nation, but
absolutely. All right. In conclusion, this is a good chapter. There's a couple of parts in this chapter that was like, do we have to recite the whole thing? Or like, how Seriously. Do we do this in such a way that, because Hayek's a good writer, and then implementing people like Milton in there certainly helps. But I think one of the big takeaways is like what you said at the beginning, is engaging with the reality in front of you rather than the reality you wish it to be. Wishful thinking does not just terraform reality to whatever you think it ought to be. You deal in a real reality. There's a immaterial reality, and then there's something that you want to build upon, like eliminate poverty, redistribute wealth, make everyone wealthy, everyone prosperous, everyone gets a private jet, everyone gets their own boat, like everyone gets all these things that all the rich people have. It's like that's not material reality, because who would be making all that stuff, and who, you'd have to go through a whole bunch of central planning, coercion just to get to that point. And then they quickly realize, okay, well, the material reality is going to say we can make equal outcomes, but they're just going to be way lower than the expectations are. And eventually, material reality meets this perceived reality, this new reality they want, and it just doesn't end up in the spot that they thought it was going to.
Yep. Yeah, and a lot of that engaging in the material reality. I mean, again, this is Hayek was look, the war is coming to a close, and he's like, okay, Nazi's not the threat anymore. It's the collectivism. It's not the collectivism that turned into Nazism, or the collectivism that is Nazism. It's the seeds of collectivism here at home. That's the big threat that we have to engage in. And one of the ways that we're seeing that them making their arguments or trying to make their claim on our society is to continue the war economy into peacetime. And that really goes back. I mean, people can listen to all the examples that we gave in our last discussion of chapters 12 and 13, but that happened in Germany and around World War I, that happened in Great Britain in World War II, and in America today. We see people wanting to use a war economy and metaphors for the war economy, like direct metaphors for their own stupid plans. And so like Hayek is very much pivoting to, okay, we fought the threat of Nazi collectivism. Great. Now let's look at the collectivists here in the West, because a bigger threat.
Yeah, good point, because this Nazi collectivism was just immoral collectivism. We're trying to build a moral collectivism, right?
Exactly.
What we talked about here. It's building a moral case for a moral collective future, and it just becomes disaster. Because like he so brilliantly explained, when you believe that there should be this high collective societal moral standard and you completely ignore this individual moral standard, and it just takes a backseat, a secondary thought in the mind of the collective, what makes people think as an individual they ought to even act morally. And then when you have people, it's like, all right, well, if I act just a little immorally here and there, the collective whole is going to kind of make up for, what I'm doing here, get everyone thinking that. And then pretty soon immorality becomes just a new morality to justify continuing that behavior. And then everyone gets affected by that.
Yeah, it's the contemporary equivalent of buying indulgences. It's like, well, I did this good thing, or I contributed here to get this good thing, so now I can do a bad thing. Yeah, and just another one of the big takeaways is that collectivism is the societal bystander effect. I don't have to do anything, and it's exactly what you said there. I don't have to do anything because, and you see this, by the way, it's like, well, as an individual, I can only do so much. But since I support this big sweeping government program thing or whatever, I don't have to do anything. And not only that, I'm in support of something that is way greater than I could do as an individual. And so I have now in my column, in my whatever distorted, perverse ledger in my mind of my good stuff to my bad stuff. Well, my good stuff is now tied to this giant collective morality thing. And so my individual bad stuff is like, oh, I can afford to be selfish here. I can afford to do this because, well, I support this this big societal thing. And so it's this bystander effect. And that's why Hayek said that the move towards collectivism has pushed individual morality backwards, not forwards. And that includes indifference to injustices and indifference and even in sometimes support of government human rights violations, because it's like, well, but I have so much good in my ledger because I support these big things. So what do I mean? I've done my part, right? I changed my Instagram picture to the black square or whatever, so I can do whatever I want now.
Yeah, and I think the best way to build that immune response that we talked about, right? To build that immune response is to, as weird as it sounds to say today, having that effective propaganda to be able to sell that American dream to the people. And, to me, when it comes to selling things, if you ever work a lot with salespeople, the best way to sell the most effective way to sell anything to anyone is to try to do what they did. What was it? Inception, the idea, but in a more simpler form, is you want to implant an idea in the person you're trying to sell to in their head to make it seem like it's their own idea to buy this thing, or that they're coming up with their own ideas how to use this thing. And really in America, we've just become really bad car salesmen. We're saying, yeah, the people who do still advocate for American exceptionalism are just saying, yeah, it's this amazing thing. You'll become rich. You'll become powerful. You can gain, political power, or, you can get rich fast or get rich quick. It's all of these really poor sales tactics that are just not believable to anyone, because we lost this essential sales skill to be like, you want this idea because look around us. Everyone is becoming, a bit more prosperous. Doesn't mean everyone's going to be a mega rich millionaire, but we all can live together as a community with an extremely diverse population, extremely diverse in America. This is truly, they call it an American experiment because this is unique. It has not been tried anywhere else on the planet, where you have this many different people coming from Europe, Africa, all around the globe, to be able to come to one spot and be able to coexist with one another as well as we do. And now that's starting to degrade because we're not selling that experiment anymore. We're saying, oh, get in your own sections, get in your own cliques. Don't mess with the people who have the red hats on. We got to look at people at their skin color now, because we got to create an out group. There are all these different things that just destroy that experiment. And for the little people left trying to still sell it, have an inability to do so. It's ineffective propaganda.
Yeah, I'll quote Hayek again here. The main cause of this ineffectiveness is that those directing it or selling it, to use your example, seem to have lost their own belief in the peculiar set of values of our civilization, or be completely ignorant of the main points on which it differs from that of other people. And I think that second part is the most important one there. Is it's with the car salesman thing. It'd be like if someone had never driven a car, understood how it worked, or never even engaged with it, trying to sell it. They're like, well, it looks neat. And so I think that we've gotten completely disconnected. And I've gotten into this before about liberty and freedom as a good, or as a currency, to quote James Darien, that the more disconnected you are from it, you're not going to sell it because you've never used it. You don't know, or at least you're not aware of your use of it or aware of its relevance in your life. So how can you? And that's what Hayek is saying, is that they have no idea. They're so unfamiliar with it. They're not acquainted. They're ignorant of how it differs from those of other countries. That's where you can get people making insane comparisons between us and like Denmark or Australia or something. And it's just like, no, you can't do this because these are different things. And yeah, and honestly, that ineffectiveness of propaganda, I think for Hayek, it was a call to action. He was saying, hey guys, we got to rally. We have to remember what made Great Britain great. We got to do that. And at least there was propaganda in that instance. For me, it feels like a lament. It feels like we don't even have that. We have to remember what made us great. And I think that means re-engaging with liberty and the fruits of liberty and the need for liberty. I think we need things like rites of passage and all these other things. We need to move away from paternalism. But anyway, yeah, not to end on a downer note, but that it is what it is there. So I don't really have anything else there other than that it's weird to say we need effective propaganda. So let's just say we need to re-engage with what made this country great and beautiful and such a tremendous and unique experiment, as you so accurately put it in the first place. In order, and it's not for other people in this case, it's for us. We have to be reminded. We have to be reminded of what the American experiment created. And we have these bad actors, a lot of them, who are co-opting the naivete and the ignorance and the frustration of people. And they're creating this very effective, it's funny, and I'm not trying to equate the America to like the gospel or anything, but I think it's Romans either 5 or 6, Paul talks about how people's minds have been darkened, or there's this cloud that's keeping them from seeing the truth, and the need for God in that case to remove that so that they could see the truth, so they can see what's good and true. And it feels like in a lot of ways we have these bad actors among us that have created this kind of smog and this cloud that's obscuring people's vision on just the reality of how good we have it. Like, people don't have a proper understanding. They're not calibrated to the prosperity of today in relative terms to anything else. It's all completely subjected and in a vacuum, and it's making it to where they're advocating for things that are just so destructive because they don't have any sense of as opposed to what, this as opposed to what. It's like, dear God, as opposed to what? Like a lot of other worse things. That's as opposed to what. But we've lost that. So we need to re-engage. And part of that, I think, is getting rid of the, or at least the countering the smog or the smog makers that are out there creating that collective kind of obscuring of the reality of the situation of just how freaking good we do have it,
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Something you actually brought up, not even from the book, something you brought up is that burden of responsibility, the burden of freedom. We want to push off that burden, right? Because whenever we feel like there's this burden that's, it's weight on our shoulders, we want to find a way to get it off. An easy way to do that is that parental relationship, daddy government. Give that weight to them, and now that proverbial weight is off your shoulders until they come back and put an actual weight on your shoulders, and then all of a sudden you're in a worse condition than you are now. But it's selling that initial, like, this is a burden that you should want, right? It is an exercise that exercises your muscles, that allows you to build stronger and become better, and build up a better society and leave that to your children, which in the end is really what you want to do. And you have to openly take on that burden. Don't apologize for doing it. You need to like we said, like he ended the chapter, shamelessly take on that burden and be able to advance society, to make a better future for your children. If you just put it in those terms, I think that's helpful too. I think a lot of us, you want to build a better society for them, and it's nice if you get to control that. You maintain with your liberty, you maintain your own personal capacity to control that future for them. But when you give up your liberty, all of a sudden you are no longer controlling that future. You've given all of that up, and you're subservient to whomever decides what is best for you and your family's future.
Yeah, like discipline and many other words, burden has gained a negative context, or exclusively negative. It's not that it's positive inherently, but it can have very positive connotations, as you hinted at there. So yeah, there are burdens that are not just worth shouldering, but are necessary to shoulder for personal growth and advancement, and societal growth and advancement as a result. It seems like a good place to end it. Everyone, thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting us, and sticking around and going through these. We only have a few more episodes left. So, hopefully, like I said earlier, we'll stick the landing on this one. Please, in order to support us each, please support Kevin at Engineering Politics. That's ENG_politics on Twitter. Engineeringpolitics.locals.com is probably the best one. Both of us, Locals is the best one for sure. And Engineering Politics on YouTube as well. Kevin is, I always say this, and I will maintain this, is criminally undersubscribed and underfollowed on Twitter and YouTube. So please join those. But Locals is the number one. And then also on ThinkSpot, of course, who's been really great to us and is hooking us up, I think, with another really solid interview that we're excited about, hopefully in the not so distant future, and Medium as well. Kevin, did I miss anything there when it comes to your stuff?
No, that's great, man. And make sure to follow Truman at My Mundane Mind on Twitter, at returntoreason.locals.com. Again, the best place to find our newest material. Engage in the community. It's really fun engaging with those guys.
Oh yeah,
it's actually
you see the creator hangout
part.
that they added, that Bridget and that Z-Dog MD or whatever guy. There's a thing called a creator hangout that you can do, actually, right? That I guess. Anyway, so yes, Locals is cool and adding new stuff.
Yeah,
so, yes.
yeah. Well, Locals is just the greatest medium because it not only helps, our audience engage with each other, which is truly unique. I mean, it's literally a social media platform just for the audience of these different creators, which you're not limited to just me. You go on Truman's, you go on Dave Rubin's, you go on Carlin Barasinko's, James Darian's, all different kinds of creators you can follow and learn new stuff from. So it's a great platform. But then also, while you're on there, and you can hit up Return to Reason on ThinkSpot, like we said. YouTube's a great place. Got some great interviews. Your Jody Shaw interview is just delightful. Your James Lindsay one was terrific. Bridget Fetisi, like you mentioned before, you had one with her. You've just a ton of great interviews on there. And then also you do written stuff on Medium on occasion. But I think, like you, I'm trying to get back into the written format a bit more as well. But it's just, this has taken a lot of time to do, and every second of it has been worth it, because we just get to reassociate ourselves with this material again and again and again and again. I mean, you've had to go on through every chapter at least 5 times, read through it
easily,
and being able to associate yourself with this material is only to your benefit. It doesn't mean you need to agree with everything. There's things that we've disagreed with Hayek on and wanted to ask, hey, what would you think today? that obviously we can't ask him today, but it's still just great to reassociate yourself with this wonderful work, and I hope we get to do more of these in the future.
Totally agree. All right. Thank you everyone for watching. Appreciate it. And we'll check you next time. Peace.
See ya.